It's every sailor's worst nightmare. His boat being ripped open, forced to abandon ship in rough seas.
I knew the boat was doomed.
Lost and adrift, fighting thirst, hunger, and exposure.
Chances of survival were basically zero.
With sharks circling like buzzards.
Freaking out. You're gonna die, you're gonna die.
Staying alive becomes an epic battle with the mind and the Atlantic in one man's fight to survive. In the wild, when things go bad, they go bad fast. Without warning, your life can hang by a thread. Adventurer and survivor Craig DiMartino fought back from his own wilderness disaster to reclaim his life. Now Craig meets other courageous outdoorsmen who beat the odds and return from their own fight to survive.
I'm Craig DiMartino. There are few stories in the history of survival tales as powerful as Steve Callahan's. Being lost at sea is not just a struggle against the elements, but a fight that plays out in the deep recesses of the human mind. It's a place where loneliness and despair can grow to become enemies far greater than hunger, thirst, or predators from the deep.
Sailors who challenge the ocean will tell you that they don't really control what's happening around them. They only adapt to what the sea dictates, and how well they adapt decides whether they live or die. It's a valuable lesson that Steve Callahan started learning at a young age.
My Boy Scout master had a small boat, and he would ask kids if they wanted to go out sailing. And I kind of lay down in the boat and looked out at the waves, which were sort of the same eye level, and it felt very womb-like. I felt really at home.
Steve had a knack for reading the waves, the wind, and the currents, and how to get a boat to do what he wanted. At sea is where he wanted to be.
I was probably a lot more comfortable with nature without man than in society with people.
Sailing and rock climbing have a little bit in common, I think.
Craig DiMartino talked to Steve about that intangible lure of the sea.
It's a real zen-like experience, you know. When you get the boat in sync, you're moving with the waves and this really dynamic surface, and with the wind, everything's varying all the time, and so you're in total touch with what's happening at that moment, and the past and the future kind of disappear in terms of importance, and you're just very, very present. It's a spiritual place for me. It's like, I don't know, you go climbing in Yosemite or any place like that with the grandeur you're confronted with. It's humbling and it's awesome.
Steve became a skilled mariner and ship designer. In 1980, he built the Napoleon Solo, a 21-foot cruiser responsive to light winds and forgiving in heavy weather. Part
of the reason for building Napoleon Solo was to show that you could build a boat that performed well, that could be a home, and wasn't, you know, a huge yacht or anything, that you could be very self-contained and you could do this on a relatively limited budget.
In the fall of 1981, Steve and his friend Chris sailed the Napoleon Solo from Bermuda to England. The two men successfully crossed the Atlantic in less than 2 weeks. Steve's next trip would be on his own, a solo journey back across the Atlantic to Antigua. Steve thought the voyage would be easy.
That was going to be the milk run, going across the ocean. It blows hard a lot, but it's all from behind, or mostly from behind. So I thought I'd just glide right down to the Caribbean.
But Steve was mistaken. On January 29, 1982, Steve and the Napoleon Solo set sail from the Canary Islands into the vast Atlantic. The first few days passed uneventfully, but Steve was sailing into the teeth of a huge storm. The wind started picking up, and the waves grew.
So I figured I was in for a bit of a blow, but the boat and I had been through several blows that were worse.
Soon the winds built into a gale.
I was just under a storm jib, the main was completely furled, and the boat was just like clicking along, doing 5-6 knots across these waves, and every once in a while a big breaker would hit the side of the boat, boom.
Throughout the day and night, the relentless storm battered his craft.
I kept getting up and checking things out, make sure everything's okay. I try to be proactive in these things, and everything seemed good. I was like looking at all the seams in the boat and how the bulkheads were and everything. Everything seemed cool.
Steve did his routine check. The boat was holding steady. He hit his bunk for a rest. Then, disaster.
So suddenly there was this big bang on the side of the boat. A lot of water came in immediately. I knew the boat was doomed like from a nanosecond after it happened.
Napoleon Solo crashed into something big, and the hull ripped open. Cold ocean water quickly swamped the boat. With only seconds to react, Steve collected his survival gear.
There's part of me that's freaking out. You're gonna die, you're gonna die. And there's part of me, slapped that guy and just said, shut up, let me do my thing. It was dark and I couldn't see, and I just kind of leapt up and started acting in accordance with my training. I had a life raft up on the deck. I tried to get the emergency kit out, but I couldn't. The boat started nosing down.
His next decision didn't come easily.
And the water was like just going up like this. And so I thought, hey, it's doomed. I got to get out of here and get in the raft, or this thing's going to sink and take me down with it.
7 days into his solo transatlantic trip, Steve Callahan's boat collided hard with something beneath the waves. As his boat sank, he launched his self-inflating life raft into the pitching seas. A line tethered the raft to the swamped boat.
Once I got into the life raft, I didn't want to leave Napoleon Solo until I absolutely had to, because that boat contained food, water, all kinds of things.
Watertight compartments that Steve had built into the Napoleon Solo kept it from sinking immediately.
That gave me a chance to get back on board and dive down and get some really critical equipment, especially this emergency bag that I had.
Still tethered to the boat, the raft too was in danger of being swamped.
And these big waves that would come by would hit the raft and just like smash it. It was like being in an auto accident every few minutes. It would just like completely collapse the raft, and I'd get pinched in there and water would come flying in everywhere, and I was really worried that the raft was going to tear itself to bits.
But Callahan didn't want to cut loose from his boat and lose his best chance of surviving this ordeal.
I was going through all these kind of dream-like scenarios of, oh, well, maybe if it gets light, I can see where the damage is, and maybe I can figure out a way of repairing it and pump the boat out and actually carry on my way. You know, you never want to leave the boat until you know it's completely doomed.
But the raging sea made the decision for him.
There was suddenly one of these big waves that came and hit the raft, and then it seemed suddenly very peaceful. And I looked out, and I was drifting away from Napoleon Solo.
In the darkness, Callahan watched his boat as it was pushed further and further away by the waves.
In a way, it was like, oh, now I'm totally at the mercy of what's going to happen to me, but I kind of already figured that out.
Right.
And the fact of the matter was, the raft was getting so beaten up by the ocean, being tied to the boat, that I kind of felt a relief.
Now he was truly alone, tossed from wave to wave in a storm-churned ocean.
That's really when I hammered myself for all my failures and all that kind of stuff.
Steve noted the date, February 5th, day one of his new life.
The first thing I did was tie everything into the raft. With the raft being vulnerable, you know, you lose a bit of equipment, that's it, you're done.
His top priority was food and water. Luckily, the survival kit had 8 one-pint cans of fresh water, a can of peanuts, a bag of dry beans, and a box of raisins. So for the time being, his immediate needs were taken care of.
It really was a very, very difficult time. I was like, well, how am I going to live out here? I don't have enough water, I don't have enough food to even get to the shipping lanes. So I figured my chances of survival were basically zero.
Steve Callahan's dream of sailing solo across the Atlantic sank along with his boat. Now he has been adrift in the ocean for over a week. Surviving this ordeal would take a lot more reserves than his limited supplies.
I started to adapt the attitude that this is not the end of a voyage, it's a continuation. It's just in a little bit more humble craft. So develop a shipboard routine, keep a log, exercise, navigate, normalize life as much as possible in order to get through this period of disorientation and fear into a period of adaptation or the survival routine.
Steve took a careful inventory of everything he managed to salvage from his boat.
Almost all survival experiences are somehow trying to figure out how to solve problems in an isolated environment with limited resources. And in a life raft, the resources are pretty limited. So you get right down to basics of living and what you really need.
He had grabbed some medical supplies, coils of line of various diameters, and a fishing kit.
It was like, 50-foot piece of string and a little trout hook, and I was like, maybe I'll catch a few bait fish or something with this, but it was pretty useless.
More valuable was a stock of signal flares.
I had a whole arsenal of flares of very good types. Parachute flares, which go up, they pop a little parachute, they hang in the air for a very long time. Plus I had meteor flares that would go up and down much quicker, and then hand location flares. So the idea is you send up the parachutes first, if somebody sees that, they get close to you, and then you do the hand flares.
Also in the kit was a last-minute addition he had picked up just before he started his trip.
A little shorty spear gun that I bought in the Canary Islands. I figured, well, this might come in handy when I get to the Caribbean, maybe I'll do a little spear fishing, but it was really almost a toy.
He also had an emergency radio transmitter,
which sends out an SOS signal. And they were being monitored by aircraft, but an aircraft had to be within about 250 miles of you or nobody would hear you.
It would only transmit a signal as long as its battery lasted. It was a long shot that any airliner would be passing over that empty part of the ocean. However, the most critical piece of survival gear was decidedly the most low-tech, a saltwater distillation still.
It's like a little environment where you can pour seawater from the top and it drips down the inside in this black cloth, which the idea is that the sun comes out and evaporates fresh water out of the salt, and it collects on the inside of this balloon and rains down on the inside into a little collection bag.
Without fresh water, Steve would die. After many frustrating failed attempts, Steve got the still to work. He started producing a few ounces of fresh water just as his canned supply ran dry.
I had 8 pints to start with, which was a good start, and that gave me a window of opportunity to get the solar stills working, and then they would produce maybe a pint and a half a day on a good day.
A few other little items, easily overlooked, also proved helpful to Steve.
One of the most important things that I had were these little dime store pads of paper and pencils, because that would allow me to keep a log, and that was really important to me, both from a pragmatic level in terms of doing navigational notes and stuff, knowing when, now I'm going through a shipping lane, I should keep better watch for ships, to the psychological element of this being a continuation of a voyage. I'm still in command of a little boat, I'll keep a log, and be able to step outside all the pain and frustration and all of that, and be able to observe things almost like a third person looking down upon me. And that was really important.
Bobbing along behind the raft, was a tall marker buoy salvaged from the boat. Tethered by a line, the buoy was there to help would-be rescuers spot the raft as he moved with the westward current. From a few yellow pencils, Steve fashioned a rudimentary sextant. During the day, he estimated his latitude, and with the night stars, he plotted his course.
The line that I had out the back was basically a 70-foot piece of line, so I made up a little speed distance table, like a little speedometer, and I could time seaweed or something floating by.
He knew his approximate speed and his current location, and roughly how far he was from the closest islands in the Caribbean. So Steve crunched the numbers to figure out how long he had to drift before he made landfall. The arithmetic dealt a sobering blow, a number that no one, drifting alone, had ever endured before. Steve Callahan was on a solo transatlantic voyage when he was forced to abandon ship in the middle of the ocean. The good news for Steve was that after nearly 2 weeks in the Atlantic, he was drifting towards the Caribbean islands. The bad news? At his current speed, it would take him 2 months to get there.
It just seemed like I'm 30 years old and what have I done? Well, I've drawn a few pictures, I designed a couple of boats, and I died. You know, it was really pretty grim.
Miraculously, he spotted a cargo ship in the distance. He scrambled to fire a few flares.
And the ship just goes steaming right by. And it was close enough I could smell the diesel in the air.
The vessel disappeared over the horizon.
And I was pretty upset.
A number of large fish started to swim alongside and tag along with the raft. These were dorados, square-headed, 3-foot-long aquamarine fish with yellow tails. They're popularly known as mahi-mahi. Steve took aim with the spear gun.
I might hit one, but not strong enough so that it would go through the fish. And within about 24 hours, they knew exactly what the range of my spear gun was, and they'd be like swimming just outside that range.
The large 30 to 40-pound fish darted close to the raft and often intentionally struck the raft.
Big males, which have very bony, square-shaped heads, would hit it quite powerfully. In fact, when I was lying down inside, I have to make sure that my head was on like a gear bag or something like that, because otherwise it'd be just like somebody coming up and just whacking me.
Steve leaned over the raft, poised for hours with spear gun at the ready, awaiting an unsuspecting fish. He nailed it. Fresh food for the first time in weeks.
When I caught the first fish, all of a sudden the other fish that were there went into this kind of frenzy, and they kept smacking the bottom of the raft, just smack, 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 smack. Wouldn't let me have any rest or anything, and I felt like I was caught in this Alfred Hitchcock Birds kind of thing. It was I'm in the fish, and the fish are eventually going to destroy the raft and eat me. And that went on for quite a while.
Steve cut the fish meat into 1-inch thick strips, 6 inches long. He pierced a hole in the strip and hung it from a string he'd tied across one corner of the raft. He called this area the butcher shop.
And I start eating it, and it was like, oh man, this is good.
One fish gave enough food for 3 or 4 days. Days passed into weeks. Steve's shipboard routine kept his mind on the task at hand, survival. Along with his still and collected rainwater, a steady supply of fish and even an occasional bird kept his body nourished. But there were always present dangers from the elements and the sea that could take his life at any moment.
I was concerned about sharks. I wasn't concerned so much that they were gonna like leap up and drag me out of the raft or something like that, but I knew they could be quite aggressive. I was kind of asleep, and all of a sudden on the bottom of the raft was this flap, 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 and it was a Dorado. And then boom, the whole raft was just like thrown off the surface of the water, and it was a shark going after the Dorado that was under the raft. I was, of course, heart in the mouth and the whole bit, and I grabbed the spear gun and I kept jabbing at it, and I finally got a couple of good hits on it and it went away.
Whatever challenge he faced, Steve never let go of his lifeline, his daily routine.
There were always jobs to do, and I would concentrate on doing jobs while trying to conserve energy and having some kind of a balance in there. And then dusk would finally come along and I would fish and call it a day.
In his small notebooks, Steve tallied the monotonous passing of the days. Everything was going as well as could be expected until March 19th, day 43 of this epic survival journey. Steve had speared a Dorado. The fish broke away, and with the spear point sticking through its side, it rammed the raft. It tore a 4-inch gash in the raft just below the waterline. The raft began to deflate.
On the 43rd day, when the Dorado tore into the tube, and that was the low point.
I wasn't going any further. Out of steam, physically, emotionally, mentally, and it was clear that, this was all for naught. I just spent the last month and a half or whatever just struggling, and I'm not going to be able to get back and fix anything, and I'm going to die here, and all my past sins are going to remain, and I can't do anything about it.
The withering raft made it impossible to keep the fresh water still functioning. And it was getting harder to catch and butcher fish in the deflating raft. If he couldn't patch the gaping hole, the consequences were dire. The raft would collapse and send Steve to the bottom of the ocean. Steve knew an answer had to be within reach, somewhere amongst the scraps of gear he stowed in the raft. His life depended on figuring out a solution. Find out how on the next Fight to Survive.